The child had been crying for so long that even the strangers passing beside the compound had begun to stare in discomfort. Yet Olaniyi did not move. He sat comfortably in front of the hut like a man with no burden on his shoulders. His body relaxed, his legs stretched, his mind settled in the peace of his own comfort, while the sharp cry of his son rose again and again from inside the hut behind him. At the back of the hut, where the cooking place stood, Bimpe was bent over the fire, trying to prepare food while her ears remained fixed on the child's voice. Smoke rose around her face, sweat gathered on her neck, and her movements had the slow heaviness of a woman already tired before the day had even finished. Then she called out, her voice strained but respectful. "Olaniyi, please help me carry Segun for a moment." Her voice traveled from the back of the hut to where he sat, clear enough for any man to hear, but Olaniyi did not answer. Segun cried louder inside the hut, his tiny voice rising with the stubborn desperation of a baby who only wanted warmth, touch, and comfort. Bimpe turned the food quickly and called again, this time louder. "Olaniyi, please, hold your son for me." Olaniyi shifted where he sat and frowned, as if the cries and the call were both an irritation to his peace. "That boy cries too much," he muttered to himself. "You have carried him too much. Leave him there." At the back of the hut, Bimpe paused for one brief moment, closed her eyes, and swallowed her frustration. Her body ached, her mind was stretched. The fire before her needed attention, and the child inside the hut was crying like his little chest would break. Still, she tried again. "Please," she called, her voice softer now. "Just carry him for a short moment." This time, with visible irritation, Olaniyi stood up from where he had been sitting and entered inside. He stood over the baby and looked down at him as Segun cried harder, his face wet, his fists clenched, his little body twisting with discomfort. Olaniyi only stared at him. "Why are you crying like this?" he asked sharply. "Must the whole compound hear your voice?" Segun cried even harder. Olaniyi clicked his tongue, shook his head, and turned back out of the hut. He had gone in, looked at his son, and walked away without touching him. At the back of the hut, Bimpe heard his footsteps returning empty, and something inside her sank immediately. "Did you carry him?" she called. "No," Olaniyi answered without shame as he settled back into his seat in front of the hut. "Leave him, he will stop." Bimpe dropped what she was doing at once and hurried from the kitchen space, moving quickly toward the hut with the fear of a mother whose heart was already ahead of her. The moment she entered, the sight of Segun pierced her. His small face was wet with tears, his breath was rough from crying too much, and his tiny body shook with helplessness. She bent quickly, scooped him into her arms, and pressed him to her chest. My son, I am here," she whispered as she rocked him gently. "Do not cry, your mother is here." Slowly, his cries broke into soft whimpers. She stood there comforting him and pulling herself together. Then she carried him outside and stood before Olaniyi, who looked at her as though he had done nothing wrong. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why could you not carry your own child?" Olaniyi looked at her with annoyance instead of shame. "Because you are the one causing it, always carrying him," he said, "always rushing to carry him whenever he cries. That is why he cannot stay alone." Bimpe stared at him in disbelief. "He is just a baby, Olaniyi." He rose to his feet and faced her fully. "So what if he is a baby?" he snapped. "Must I carry him every time he opens his mouth? Am I the mother?" The words landed heavily on her. "I was cooking," she said, her voice trembling now. "I only asked you to help me for a moment." But Olaniyi scoffed with cold pride. "Help you with what? You are only behind the hut cooking. What exactly is too much for you to do?" For one second, Bimpe could not even answer. Of all the things he could have said, that was the one that stung most. "I have been doing everything," she finally said. "I carry Segun, I cook, I clean, I work, I barely rest." Olaniyi laughed in the careless way of a man who had never carried what he mocked. "Women do these things every day. Stop behaving like you are the first wife to give birth." The air between them became very heavy. Shegun had gone quiet in Bimpe's arms, but her own heart had become louder than his cries. I am tired, she said, no longer hiding it. Tired of doing everything alone. Olaniyi's face tightened at once. Watch how you speak to me, he said. Do you not bring that foolishness before me? You are becoming lazy, and now you want to use this child as your excuse. Bimpe stood still for a long moment, looking at him the way a woman looks at a man she is beginning to see clearly for the first time. She did not shout nor cry. She simply turned and walked back into the hut with Shegun in her arms. But as she sat down and held her child close, something changed quietly inside her. She had begged, she had explained, she had endured. At that moment, she began to understand that a woman's silence can carry more danger than her anger. And outside, sitting again, Olaniyi had no idea that the very thing he called weakness was slowly turning into the strength that would one day confront him. The next morning, before the sun had climbed high, Bimpe was already awake, tying little Shegun firmly to her back, gathering what was needed for the day, and preparing herself for the work ahead. Olaniyi was ready too, but not with the weight she carried. He walked before her with the ease of a man who believed the world had arranged itself properly around him, while Bimpe followed with the child on her back, his tiny head resting against her as she moved. At the farm, the morning stretched into labor. Olaniyi bent to his own work and expected her to continue beside his without complaint. Bimpe worked so hard, and from time to time shifted her body carefully when Shegun stared behind her. When the child began to cry under the heat and strain of the day, she stopped and tried to calm him, but Olaniyi looked at her with irritation. Will you spend the whole day adjusting that child? He asked sharply. Bimpe swallowed her reply and continued. The hours dragged on. Her back ached from carrying Shegun, her arms grew weak, and sweat ran down her face, but still she walked because there was no other choice placed before her. At one point, Shegun began crying harder, and Bimpe stretching slowly, trying to soothe him with one hand while keeping herself balanced. Olaniyi, she said carefully, please help me hold him for a little while so I can walk well. Olaniyi did not even pause properly. No, he said. Tie him well and continue, or put him down instead. Bimpe stared at him for a brief moment, something bitter rising inside her. Then she lowered her eyes and continued digging with her son on her back. The day moved like punishment. By the time they finally left the farm, her feet were heavy, her shoulders burned, and Shegun had slept and cried and slept again against her body while she still kept moving. Olaniyi, however, walked home like a man returning from a normal day's duty, and the moment they entered the compound, he said, Bring food, I am very hungry. Bimpe turned slowly and looked at him, too tired at first to speak. Food? She repeated. Yes, food, Olaniyi answered as if the matter were simple. What else would a man ask for after work? For one second, Bimpe only stared at him, trying to digest what he had just said. Shegun still tied to her back, her body weak from carrying child and labor together. Then the words came out before she could stop them. Where was the food prepared, Olaniyi? She asked quietly. Was it in the farm? Olaniyi's face changed at once. He had not expected that answer. What kind of question is that? He demanded. Bimpe untied Shegun slowly from her back and held him in front of her, then looked at her husband with a tiredness that had gone beyond tears. We both came back from the farm now, she said. I walked there with your son on my back while you walked with both your hands free. We entered this compound together, and the first thing from your mouth is food. Tell me, where should it have come from? Did it follow us back from the farm? Olaniyi stepped closer, anger rising in him. Do not speak to me like that, he warned. But Bimpe was no longer speaking from sudden emotion. She was speaking from the long wound of being unseen. I am asking because I want to understand, she said. If you know I must still cook after the farm, why could you not say, give me Shegun so you can prepare food if you know you are very hungry? Can you not see that I'm very tired? Olaniyi hissed and turned away like a man who wanted to escape the mirror being held before him. All this talking is too much, he said. Just do what you're supposed to do. But Shegun had begun crying again, and Bimpe gave a dry, broken laugh that held no joy at all. Do what I am supposed to do, she repeated. I carried him to the farm. I walked with him on my back. I returned with him on my back. Now I should cook with him in my arms too, while you sit and wait to eat. Tell me, Olaniyi, what is left for you to do in this house apart from command? The child's cry filled the silence between them. Olaniyi looked at Bimpe, then at the baby, and looked away again. Pride still stood inside him like a wall, but the wall was beginning to hear cracks within itself. Yet, even then, he did not stretch out his hands for Shegun. He did not say, let me help. He simply stood there, restless and annoyed, while Bimpe turned away from him and moved toward the back of the hut again, carrying the same child, the same pain and the same burden. But this time, something else followed her, a disappointment. A question had entered her heart, and it would not leave. If a man could watch his wife suffer and still call it duty, what exactly was the difference between marriage and bondage? And as she disappeared behind the hut to face the fire once again, Olaniyi remained standing where he was, unaware that the hunger in his stomach that evening was nothing compared to the storm that had begun to gather in his house. Days passed, but nothing truly changed in the compound except Bimpe's silence. She still woke before dawn. She still tied Shegun to her back when she needed to work. She still cooked, washed, swept, and moved through each duty with the steady hands of a woman who had learned that crying did not reduce labor. But something in her had withdrawn. The soft eagerness with which she once answered Olaniyi was gone. The little warmth she used to force into her face had disappeared. Even when she spoke, it was now with the plain calmness of someone whose heart had grown tired of expecting kindness. Olaniyi noticed it, but pride would not let him question it. Instead, he grew more irritated by her quietness, as though the woman he had wounded was now offending him by no longer struggling loudly. One evening, when Shegun had finally slept after a long day of fussing, Bimpe sat just outside the hut with the child in her arms, staring ahead of her in thought. Olaniyi returned and found no food waiting before him yet, and his face darkened immediately. Bimpe, he called, why is the food not ready? She lifted her eyes slowly and looked at him. Then at the sleeping child, then back at him again. Shegun has been crying since, she said quietly. I only just got him to sleep. But Olaniyi was in no mood for patience. Must everything in this house stop because of one child? He snapped. Every day, one excuse or another. Bimpe looked down at Shegun and gently adjusted the clothes around him. He is not an excuse, she said. He is your son. That answer alone was enough to set something off in Olaniyi. He stepped forward in anger. I am warning you, he said sharply. Do not start that again. Bimpe slowly stood up with Shegun in her arms. She was tired, but there was something firm in the way she held herself now. And I am only telling you what is true, she replied. If the child keeps me from moving fast, then that is the truth. If I am doing everything alone, then that too is the truth. Olaniyi stared at her, shocked less by her words than by the fact that she stood there and said them without fear. You are becoming too bold, he said. Bold? Bimpe repeated, and for the first time there was a faint bitterness in her voice. No, I am only becoming honest. Olaniyi stared at her as if he had suddenly found a stranger standing where his wife used to be. Since this child came, your tongue has become too sharp, he said coldly. But Bimpe did not lower her eyes this time. No, she answered. Since this child came, my suffering has become too visible for me to keep pretending. The words hit him harder than he expected. And for a moment, he had nothing to say. Then he brushed past her and sat down heavily in front of the hut. Do whatever you want, he muttered. Just make food. Bimpe stood still for a moment, looking at him, and something final settled inside her. Without another word, she turned and went inside the hut with Shegun. Time passed. Olaniyi waited. The food did not come. At first, he thought she was taking too long. Then he grew annoyed. Then restless. Finally, he stood up and entered the hut expecting another excuse. But what he found unsettled him. Bimpe was sitting quietly on the mat with Shegun beside her. Not sleeping, not crying, just sitting there like someone who had made a decision. She looked up at him, and there was no trembling in her face anymore. "Where is the food?" he demanded. Bimpe answered with the calmness that chilled him more than tears ever could. "I have not cooked." Olaniyi blinked in disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said I have not cooked," she repeated. "Today, I do not have the strength." His anger rose immediately. "So you will refuse to cook for me in my own house now?" But Bimpe's voice remained steady. "No, I am not refusing because I want to insult you. I am refusing because I am human. I am tired. And if you can watch that tiredness every day and still demand more without lifting a finger, then one day the hands you depend on will simply stop." Olaniyi opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Segun began to stare between them. Bimpe picked him up and held him close, her face still calm. "I have carried enough," she said quietly, "more than enough." And as Olaniyi stood there staring at her, something unfamiliar entered his mind, a discomfort, deep and strange. He began to see that the woman he had always treated as if she would endure forever might one day reach the end of her endurance. And if that day came, he did not know what would remain of his home. That night, Olaniyi did not sleep well. He lay on his mat with his eyes wide open, long after the night had deepened, listening to the small sounds inside the hut and feeling a strange restlessness he could not explain. Bimpe's words kept returning to him. One day, the hands you depend on will simply stop. He turned from one side to the other and shut his eyes tightly, but the words remained. Before dawn fully broke, Segun began to cry again. Usually, Olaniyi would have hardened himself against the sound and waited for Bimpe to answer it. But this time, Bimpe did not rise immediately. Her body was too weak from too many days of strain. And when she finally tried to sit up, she moved slowly, one hand pressing against herself. Olaniyi noticed. He frowned. "What is it?" he asked, though his voice still carried more command than concern. Bimpe gave no quick answer. She only tried to rise again, but her strength failed her, and she sank back down. Segun's cry grew louder. For the first time, Olaniyi did not simply wait in annoyance. He sat up fully and looked from the crying child to the woman beside him, and what he saw unsettled him. Bimpe's face looked drained, with the kind of weakness that comes when the body has been pushed too far for too long. "Bimpe," he said again, more sharply now, "what is wrong with you?" She opened her eyes and answered in a voice that was almost a whisper. "I am tired." Those were the same words she had said before, but now they sounded different. Segun cried harder, and for one brief moment neither of them moved. Then something happened that had never happened before. Olaniyi stood up, walked over, and picked the child up himself. The movement was awkward, uncertain, almost unnatural in his own arms. But once Segun was lifted, the crying softened little by little. Olaniyi looked down at the boy with a strange expression, as though he had expected resistance but met dependence instead. Then he looked back at Bimpe, who was watching him through her weakness with quiet surprise. No words were spoken yet, but something had shifted. Olaniyi carried Segun outside and stood there with him, the early morning air touching both father and child. And he felt the weight of something beyond the baby in his arms. He felt the weight of all the times he had refused, the weight of every cry he had ignored, the weight of every command he had given without thought. Segun moved slightly against his chest, and Olaniyi adjusted him clumsily, afraid the child might sleep, surprised at how small and helpless he truly felt. After a while, the crying stopped completely, and the silence that remained was not empty. It was revealing. Olaniyi stood there for a long moment, staring ahead, while thoughts he had avoided for too long began to rise in him one after another. Bimpe had carried this child at home. She had carried him to the farm. She had cooked with him, walked with him, washed with him, soothed him, fed him, and stayed awake through the night with him while he, Olaniyi, had stood outside all along, speaking as if strength belonged only to the one who gave orders. Slowly he turned and went back inside the hut. Bimpe was sitting up now, though still weak, watching him with a calm face. Olaniyi stood there with Shegun in his arms, and for a moment his pride fought hard within him. It wanted him to say nothing. It wanted him to return the child and walk away. But the sight of Bimpe's tired face and the warm, trusting body of Shegun against his chest broke something small but important inside him. "You were right," he said at last, the words sounding strange even to his own ears. Bimpe did not answer immediately. Olaniyi swallowed and forced himself to continue. "I did not see it. I did not want to see it. But you were right." Bimpe looked at him steadily, and in that quiet look he felt more exposed than if she had shouted. "This child is ours," she said softly. "This home is ours. But I have been carrying both alone." Olaniyi lowered his eyes for the first time in a long while. He looked at Shegun, then back at her. "I know," he said, and the words came heavier now. "I know," but even as he said them, another truth sat in the space between them. Seeing a wound was not the same as healing it. And as Bimpe stretched out her hands slowly for Shegun, Olaniyi felt a rising fear he had never known before. The fear that a man feels when he begins to understand the value of something only after he had nearly broken it beyond repair. From that morning, something began to change in the compound, though not all at once. Olaniyi did not become a different man in one day, and Bimpe did not suddenly forget all the pain she had carried. But the wall of pride that had stood inside him began to crack little by little. At first, it showed in small things. When Shegun cried, Olaniyi no longer waited for Bimpe to answer first. Sometimes he lifted the child before she could even rise. When Bimpe went to the back to cook, he stayed nearby with the baby instead of sitting in front of the hut like a man with no duty. When they went to the farm, he no longer walked ahead as if her burden belonged to her alone. One afternoon, while Bimpe prepared to tie Shegun to her back again, Olaniyi stopped her and stretched out his hands. "Give him to me," he said. Bimpe looked at him carefully, as if she had not heard well. "You will carry him?" she asked. Olaniyi nodded. "Yes." She gave him the child slowly, watching his face. Olaniyi held Shegun close and adjusted him against his chest with more confidence than before. "You cannot keep doing everything alone," he said quietly. Bimpe did not answer at once. She only looked at him with a deep, searching silence. At the farm that day, the sun still burned, the work was still hard, and the earth did not become soft because one man had changed his attitude. But something in Bigbe's spirit eased for the first time in a long while. Olaniyi carried Shegun when he cried. He even sat with him while Bimpe finished what she was doing. And though his hands were still learning and his movements were still rough in places, the effort was real. When they returned home that evening, Olaniyi did not sit and ask for food like a king waiting to be served. Instead, he looked at Bimpe and said the words she had waited too long to hear. "You have worked enough for today. Rest small. I will make the fire ready." Bimpe stood still in shock. For one second, she almost laughed because the change felt so strange after so much pain. "Olaniyi," she said softly, "are you serious?" He looked at her with a humility she had never seen clearly in him before. "I have done enough wrong," he said. "Let me at least begin to do right." That night, after they had eaten and Shegun had finally fallen asleep, Olaniyi sat beside Bimbe outside the hut under the quiet sky. There was no anger between them, no shouting, no bitterness in the air, only the weight of all that had happened and the fragile piece of what might still be repaired. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Olaniyi broke the silence. "Bimbe," he said, his voice lower than she had ever known. "Forgive me." She turned and looked at him carefully. He did not hide behind pride this time. He did not defend himself. He did not speak like a man doing her a favor by apologizing. He spoke like a man who had finally seen himself clearly. "Forgive me for every time I sat and watched you struggle. Forgive me for every time I spoke as if your pain was laziness. Forgive me for making you carry what I should have carried with you." Bimpe's eyes grew wet, but she did not interrupt him. "I thought being a man meant giving others and being served," Olaniyi continued. I did not know that a man can be inside his own home and still fail his family. But now I know. I know that strength is not in sitting down while your wife suffers. Strength is in standing beside her. Bimpe lowered her head and tears began to roll down her cheeks. You wounded me deeply, Olaniyi, she said at last. There were days I felt like I was alone, even while married. Olaniyi nodded slowly, receiving the truth without resistance. I know, he said, and I will spend my days making sure you never feel that way again. Bimpe looked at him for a long moment. She had every right to remain hard, every right to keep her heart closed. But somewhere inside her, beyond the pain, she could see that what sat before her now was not just a guilty husband, but a man beginning to change. I will forgive you, she said softly. But do not let this change end in words. Olaniyi bowed his head. It will not. For the first time, they sat together as two people facing the same direction. And inside the hut, little Shegun slept in peace, unaware that the cry his father once refused to answer had become the very cry that saved his home. The moral lesson in this story is that a home cannot stand on one person's strength alone. Love is proven when burdens are shared, not when one person suffers in silence. If this story touched your heart, then remember this. Many people are not lazy. They are simply tired from carrying too much alone. Let us learn to love better, help more, and value the silent sacrifices happening inside our homes. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more deep life changing stories. Thank you for watching. See you in my next story.